Now before we begin, you'll see over here that I imported an abandoned city asset pack to use as example assets. Now there are a couple adjustments we'll need to do to make sure everything works consistently. I highly recommend you do this for all your assets to avoid any additional tedious work later on. First, take all the street meshes and make sure their pivots are centered and at the bottom. Now to save on time and complexity, I will only be using these 4 meshes, but they will constitute as most of what you need. Now, second thing you need to do is make sure your street signs and street lamps have their pivots correctly set at the base. Alright, and with that, we're ready to go. Now, for starters, we're going to need a blueprint to contain the spline and all its components. And we're going to put that in a new folder called PCG. We'll call it City Spline, City Spline BP. Add on the spline and then the PCG component. Alright, next thing we need to do is right click on the spline and make it a circle. And the second thing I do will clean up this little mistake here. Alright, and then make it a closed loop, and make sure that unlike me, you only have one point there. And now we'll create the main PCG graph. Drag that over into our blueprint and then save everything. Now what we need next are 2 important variables, street width and street length. Make them both visible and as type float. Now before moving on, something I forgot to do is give these variables a value. So give both the street length and width a value of 900. Next, in the construction script window, drag out the PCG graph and add 4 set vector parameters. We're going to call them street X positive, street X negative, street Y positive, and street Y negative. Alright, for the X values, we're going to take the street width, divide it by 2. This will be the street X positive. And then multiply by -1 for the negative. And then do the same for the Y with the street length. Now with that done, we can go into the graph itself. Alright, compile save. And now we're going to add 4 parameters. Make them vectors. And then copy over the parameter names. Alright, now add a spline data node. And then a spline sampler. Set to on interior and select unbound. And for the interior sampling, we're going to get the street length from our blueprint with a get actor property node. Copy over the name of the variable. Now that goes into the interior sample spacing. Then divide it by half to get the border sampling spacing. And now we're going to duplicate this setup, but have all the values be doubled. Now we're going to add reroute nodes, and we're going to call them grid points and starting points. The first one will be the main city grid that everything will follow, and the second one will serve as the spawn points for our streets and buildings. Alright, now lower in the graph, we'll add our starting points, and attribute noise, and then sort by density. Alright, next create an attribute filter, and for this one we'll create a new variable called number of streets. But first we need to make it filter out by index. Leave it with a default value of 15, and make it an integer. Now make sure you copy over the name and plug that into the filter. Now what we're going to do next is add an attribute partition, sort by index, and from here we're going to set their individual density with a loop graph. And for that, create a new PCG graph, call it set density subloop graph. Add it to the main graph, make it a loop, and then open it up. Once in the graph, we're going to change the input and the output to be points only. And the in will be relabeled as loop. We're also going to create a second input called number of points, and make that an attribute set. Now what we're going to do is pretty simple. We're going to take a value of 1, divide it by the number of points, to make sure that each individual street will have its own density evenly distributed between 0 and 1. So create 1, divided by number of points, multiply by the loop index, and then set that as the density before putting the out. Now back in the main graph, connect the number of streets, and then check to make sure everything is working. Alright, now that everything's working as it should, on to the second subgraph. Alright, now we need another loop graph and call it grid point selection. And then we're going to create a duplicate of that called grid point inner subgraph. First thing we're going to do is grab the grid point selection and put that into our main graph. as a loop, and then grab the inner subgraph and place that inside the first subgraph. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and make 2 point inputs and then 5 attribute inputs. Those inputs will be the grid, the starting points, the segment size, the minimum and maximum segments width, and the minimum and maximum segments length. And make sure you have the grid points set up as the loop. And then after that, we're going to have to set up these same exact inputs for the inner subgraph, only with one additional input called LW select. Now this LW select will be a little different from our usual inputs. It will be what is called a feedback input. Its main purpose is to switch between horizontal and vertical streets every loop cycle. Now, before we begin the graph work, we need to make sure everything is properly connected. And we also need to give our LW select a starting value of 0. Now back in the main graph, we're going to add the base street points. And for the size, we're going to take the street length and divide it by 2. And now we can also plug in our starting points. Now you'll probably want to create actor-controlled variables for the rest, but to save on time, I'll just use some simple attributes. We're going to have 1 as both the min and max for street width, 10 for the minimum length, and 75 for the maximum length. Now in the graph, we're going to get the grid points and branch them out according to our feedback. And now output A is going to be rotated 90 degrees before going into an attribute filter. Output B will also require an attribute filter, but will not be rotated. Next, we're going to set those attribute filters to filter by position. Now we're going to get the starting point and get the position using a get attribute from point index. And feed that both into a subtract node and an add node. Those will be our filter mins and our filter max. From here, we need a make vector attribute node. Add that to both the add and subtract node. From here, we need 2 multiply nodes, one for the x and one for the y. Grab the size and turn that into a reroute node so we don't have lines crossing everywhere. And put that into both multiplies. From here, we need 2 select nodes. And we're going to use the LW select node. Grab 2 clamp nodes, and then alternate them in the select nodes. And now those clamp nodes will take your road's length and width minimums and maximums. Move around the chords a little so it doesn't become unreadable spaghetti. And then a reroute node for the length and width select. Alright, now add two more multiplies. And we're going to get the starting point density. And now we're going to multiply that density with our maximum length. And the same for the maximum width. Now we're going to save that density as a reroute node. Now at the end of our two attribute filters, we're going to add two set nodes. And we're going to pass over the density from the starting point. Next, we're going to add attribute. And what we're going to give them is a sort of label to designate each individual street. Then from here we can create our outputs, output A and output B. And then get the loop index and plug that into our add attribute. Now for our feedback loop, we need a select node. Make it select between 1 and 0. And then we'll use the density to switch between the two. And I will flip 1 to be the A put and 0 to be the B put, because that's what I had in my original graph. Alright, and then next we're going to move up and create the same A and B outputs for our main graph. Alright, now back in the main graph, we're going to add two merge points and debug them to see our results. Looking pretty good. We have our vertical streets and our horizontal streets. However, we need to get rid of overlap, so we're going to add self-pruning nodes. And change to self-prune by density. Up next, merge the two streets together and add a set node. And these will be our base street points. And then down below, we're going to do the same thing, but this time without merging the streets. These two will be crossed using an intersection node to create the intersections. Up next, we can lead that into a static mesh spawner, while also adding a difference node. And make sure to switch that difference node to binary. Now we're going to go over to our street segments. And I don't know what happened to this one. Something seems to have gone wrong with the shader. Well, for now, we'll just grab the one piece we need, the 4-cross intersection. We'll worry about the corner piece later. Now moving back over, you can see it is being spawned correctly. A little below ground, so we'll drag the spline upwards a bit. And as you can see, we have our street intersections. Alright, now back in the main graph, we're going to grab 2 transform points nodes. And we're going to grab the street y positive and the street y negative. And put that into our transform offsets. And the transform points that will be moved on the y negative will also require a 180-degree turn. And then 2 difference nodes that will use each other as sources. Now these 2 difference nodes will lead into the difference node we used for the cross intersection. This will be for our right corners and 3-way intersections. Now at the end of those 2, we will add a transform points. We also need an intersection node that will cross between the 4-way intersection and the other 2 difference nodes. And then we are going to need the street y positive. Put that into our transform points, offset min and max. Then we're going to combine the 2 into a set node, and we are going to once again set the density back to 1. After which, you'll want an intersection node with our base street points. Followed by a difference node set to binary, and we'll exclude the 4-way intersections. Do a quick check to make sure we're getting all the points we need. Now up next, we need to find the correct rotation for each corner piece. Now create a bonds modifier and set the bonds min to 6 and the bonds max to 0.1. Now create a difference node. And then copy and paste over the base street points. Alright, now add 3 more difference nodes. And then from the bonds modifier, add 3 transform points nodes. Now connect each transform node to a difference node. Alright, now we need to make sure that each transform node has a different rotation. 90, 180, 270, From here, we need 4 density filters. Note this is instead of setting the difference nodes to binary, so we can have a more controllable gradient of what we include or exclude. Alright, up next we need a total of 4 intersection nodes. The intersection nodes are how we detect the corners. And then 1 difference node. The intersection nodes are our 2-way corners, and the difference node is our 3-way intersection. Add 2 static mesh spawners. And then we'll be able to see our results once we give them our static meshes. Alright, since the material on this one still doesn't seem to be working, I'll go ahead and grab the other corner. Alright, it looks like we got our 3-way intersections going on correctly, but our 2-way corners seem to have something going on. Alright, there we go. I forgot to switch the last difference node to binary. With that, our 2-way intersections and our 3-ways are not overlapping. With that done, we can now start spawning our regular street segments. Grab our base street points and a static mesh spawner. Now let's go over and find our street mesh. Browse to asset and select it for a spawner. And now we just need to difference our intersections. Alright, almost done. Now we just need to rotate the corners correctly. Alright, let's try 90. Looks like not quite right. One more time. And now with 180. And now with a 180 turn, all our segments are rotated correctly. Alright, with the streets done, we can now move on to the secondary street objects. First off, I want some traffic lights. For that, come over to the 4-way intersection and grab 4 transform nodes. Get 4 add nodes. We're going to do some math to make sure everything is placed correctly. And then add a static mesh spawner so we can see our traffic lights. Alright, now let's go over and find our traffic lights. Alright, right now they're being spawned right in the center of the road, so we need to move them over to the corners. For that, we need to grab our street X's and our street Y's. Plug them each into an add node, and then we'll begin crossing them over to get our four corners. Now I just need to make sure I have them matched correctly. Alright, that should be our transform nodes offset min and max. And it looks like we still need to give them a little bit of rotation. Alright, the first one will take 180. The second one we can skip. The third one 90. And the last one negative 90. Looking good, alright. Up next, streetlights. Alright, now copy over the two transform and difference nodes we used over here. Those we can combine into a single static mesh spawner. Alright, now we can grab our streetlight. Now grab our base 3 points. It's not quite right yet because we need our street X's instead of our street Y's. Alright, now we just need to fix the rotation. Let's try 90 and negative 90. Alright, looking good. Now we could just call it a day and leave it as is, but I actually want more control over how often our streetlights are being spawned. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to move back over here, grab our two streets and create splines. Create two reroute nodes for those. I'm going to call the first one street spline A and the second one street spline B. Now we can grab the two street splines down here and grab a spline sampler. First, we need to do an attribute partition. And we're going to partition by our street spline number. Alright, just checking, make sure everything looks good. Alright. Alright, now we need to grab our distance increment and create a attribute. But make sure to give that attribute a value before switching to on distance. Honestly, kind of embarrassing that I did it twice. Alright, up next, grab a extents modifier. For the extents, we're going to use our street length. And we're going to divide that by 8. Alright, now to check on the size of the points. But they're not showing up. Ah, there we go. I forgot to check on bound. That's that little check mark right here. And that's why it's important to routinely check your graph to make sure everything's working correctly. Alright, now from here we can connect our extents modifier into our transform nodes. But two things we need to do now. We need to switch our street X's back into street Y's. And now we need to change our rotations again. The first one will be 180. And the second one, I believe, can be reset back to 0. Alright, and now with that done, you can control how often you want your streetlights to appear along your streets. I'm going to space mine out a bit to around 2000. Or maybe a little more to 4000. Now we do want to prevent spawning on the street intersections, so we're going to have to add a difference node for this. We're going to create some more reroute nodes to avoid too much spaghetti. And we're going to do this for our three-way intersections and our two-way corners as well. Alright, plug those into our difference nodes. And that is done. One last thing we're going to do before we close off the video, which has gotten longer than I expected. We are going to add decals to the streets. Move over to where we have our final street points and grab a transform node. In that transform node, we're going to add plenty of randomness, depending on what kind of decal you plan on spawning. You can keep making adjustments until it no longer looks regular or uniform. Then we're going to grab a spawn actor. And what we're going to use is the default decal actor included with PCG. If you plan to make something more advanced, I would recommend creating your own, but for now this will do. Now we're going to go over and click on Allow Template Actor Editing. With that enabled, now you can open up its settings and select a decal material. I'm going to go over to where this asset pack keeps its decals. Ah, there it is. And with that, you can now see the cracks or damage appearing on the streets. And you can switch it if you want something more like a smudge. Or maybe wet puddles instead. Alright, now with our streets done, here's a quick look of what our graph will look in our next video as we go into the procedural buildings. It comes with a few neat little features like right here, building proxies. With that enabled, our full buildings will be replaced with simple squares, which are far quicker and easier to adjust and edit than full-on procedural buildings. Now you can make adjustments like change the building amount and get a full idea of what the final result will look like without having to wait long regeneration periods. And of course there's more I want to do with the streets themselves, like right here. For example, I've converted the roads into spline meshes that can adjust and curve along with the landscape. Now it's not finished yet, I still need to create a way to carve into the landscape so the streets aren't halfway in, halfway out, as you see here. But it's looking pretty good so far, and I even have it accounting for things like rivers and lakes. As you can see with the river, I added along here with the river plugin. Alright, that's all for now. If you feel like supporting me, I will have the graphs uploaded to both Patreon and Gumroad, so you can download them and have a look at the graphs yourself. It will include the sample files for both Part 1 and the upcoming Part 2.